I'll never forget the day I stepped foot inside my very first Toys R Us way back in the summer of 1982. All I wanted was to get my hands on some Star Wars figures, but my older brother dragged me to another aisle that had a bunch of other toys that I had never heard of before called G.I. Joe. To be honest, my first impression wasn't a great one. Unlike Star Wars that offered so much variety in their action figures, these bunch of little green army men seemed rather unimpressive. The G.I. Joe, a real American hero toy line, will always be remembered as one of the most successful lines of the 80s. From its start in 1982 up until its death in 1994, Hasbro created well over 500 action figures and around 250 vehicles and playsets, a feat that most other toy lines, past or present, can only dream of accomplishing. Yet, despite all the colorful characters and cool action figures that were produced, I will always hold a special place in my heart for those first Joes that started it all way back in 1982. The first real American heroes that collectors endearingly refer to as the original 13. Anyway, after being dragged into the G.I. Joe aisle against my wishes, I ended up grabbing the first Joe that caught my attention, a blonde dude whom I assumed was the leader, just to get my brother off my back so he would let me proceed to the Star Wars aisle. It wasn't until I got back from the store when I opened my first Joe when I realized just how much more awesome he was compared to the typical Star Wars figure. With added articulation to the knees, elbows, and waist, as well as removable accessories like a helmet and visor, I was mightily impressed, instantly hooked, and I needed to get more. Fast forward a year later and I had managed to get about half of the original single-pack Joes. A few of the original ones came with vehicles and so were a little harder to get. And my dad came home from another business trip with an amazing gift. He handed me a square plastic case with a cool G.I. Joe picture in the front. At first, I had no idea what he had handed to me. It turned out to be the official G.I. Joe action figure carrying case. And to my delight, it was not empty. When I opened up the case, I almost cried. Inside were most of the remaining single-pack G.I. Joe figures that I didn't have, and I was instantly in kid nirvana. I remember though that I didn't get much time to play with them initially since we had to rush off to Sunday Mass. But as the Mass was going on, I swear all I could imagine were G.I. Joes standing in attention around the altar. Anyway, when G.I. Joe was reborn in 2007 with a 25th anniversary toy line, one objective I set out to do was to complete the original 13 members. It wasn't easy as there were so many other characters that fans preferred and Hasbro aimed to produce. But in the end, over a span of a few years, Hasbro did manage to release modern updates of the original 13. And I got them all. To this day, they remain the crown jewel of my G.I. Joe collection. So who exactly were the original 13? Let's meet them, shall we? First up, Eric W. Freestat. Designation, Mortar Soldier. Codename, Short-Fuze. So this was Figure 0, the first G.I. Joe that got me falling into another rabbit hole. There really isn't much to say about him though. The only reason I got him was because he was blonde, and back then, thanks to Luke Skywalker, I thought that if a character was blonde, then he must be the leader. Turns out my reasoning wasn't quite off the mark, I just ended up getting the wrong blonde. Anyway, he wasn't one of the breakthrough characters from the original 13. And to be honest, not many of them were. Which is why his only modern update was found in a Colossal Target exclusive set with a bunch of vehicles I didn't really care for. So I had to resort to eBay and get my modern Short-Fuze and pay extra for accurate custom web gear that the new version didn't come with. Since he was my first Joe, he had to be as accurate as possible to the original. One touch I do like in the modern version though is that they gave him glasses, which he was often depicted with in the comic books. Anthony S. Gambello. Designation, Laser Rifle Trooper. Codename, Flash. Okay, after I got over the wonder of Short-Fuze, I quickly scanned the back of his card to see what the rest of his team looked like. Flash instantly stood out because he had these bright red pads on his uniform and was hunched over in a cool-looking battle pose. It was love at first sight and I immediately identified him as my favorite. Flash was the second Joe I hunted down and added to my collection. Aside from the red pads that easily differentiated him from the rest, his designation as a laser rifle trooper made him an instant favorite for so many kids back then. I'm assuming that it was because of this that his modern version was one of the first to be made by Hasbro, and one of the first ones that I got when I decided to restart my Joe collection. And although he never came out in the live-action G.I. Joe movie in 2009, he did get a movie-inspired figure, which while quite different still gave homage to the original figure with red padding. Unfortunately, despite his cool look, he never gained much popularity or exposure outside that one-off cartoon episode, where he was voiced by Frank Welker, the legendary voice actor behind such iconic cartoon characters such as Scooby-Doo and Megatron. And he was eventually replaced by a new laser trooper a few years later. Clayton M. Abernathy, designation Missile Commander, codename Hawk. Even if I picked the wrong one, my identification of a blonde as leader of the Joes turned out to be right. Before there was Duke, there was Hawk, and from the very start, Hawk was the leader of the G.I. Joe team. Curiously, despite being the leader, the first Hawk action figure didn't come single-packed like you would think he would. Instead, he came packaged with a vehicle add-on, the mobile missile system. To add to the confusion, the original Hawk and Short-Fuze figures had the exact same head. Actually, Flash shared the same head sculpt as well, but had brown hair. This was intentional on Hasbro's part in order to cut production costs. They used shared body parts and only 6 unique head sculpts for all 13 figures, differentiating each character through paint and accessories. Fortunately, when it came to the modern version of Hawk and the rest of the original 13, he got a unique and more distinguished head sculpt. Interestingly enough, in 1986, Hasbro released a newer version of Hawk, promoting him to the rank of Brigadier General, clearly establishing him as the top dog in the G.I. Joe ranks. They also changed his hair color from blonde to dark brown. I'm assuming this was done to make sure no one got him confused with Duke, the more popular field leader of the team. Shayna M. O'Hara, designation Counterintelligence, codename Scarlett. For the longest time, it was a strong belief of many toy companies that female action figures just didn't appeal to boys. Because of this, female representation in any toy line was usually reduced to that one token female, and for G.I. Joe, counterintelligence specialist Scarlett filled that role. She was the only figure with a completely unique sculpt from head to toe, for obvious reasons, and in a rather misguided attempt to really make her unique, or maybe more appealing to boys, they dressed her up in a very non-military looking uniform that basically was a tan-colored leotard and dark leggings. They even gave her a friggin' crossbow instead of a standard issue weapon. She looked more like a superhero than a soldier. In any case, her odd uniform didn't really bother me. What did was her head sculpt, which while kinda feminine, looked nothing like her beautiful face on the card art. And what made things worse was that she didn't have a ponytail as her card illustration hinted at, and was depicted to have in the cartoons. Her modern version, though not perfect, was a much-needed improvement from the original. She still has that leotard and crossbow, but at least she finally has a ponytail. Lance J. Steinberg, designation Vamp Driver, codename Clutch. Clutch was the first vehicle pack-in figure I got. He came with a Jeep designated as Vehicle Attack Multipurpose, or VAMP for short. I remember finding his description in his file card quite amusing, as he greases his hair with motor oil, rarely shaves, and chews on the same toothpick for months. Clutch still calls women chicks. Looking back, it was quite an interesting decision to include a male chauvinist in a toy line for kids. Anyway, because he was a vehicle driver, I always saw him as a second-class member of the team, not important enough to be sold single-carded. As it turns out though, while not reaching the heights of popularity as say Scarlett and Hawk, he did manage to get good exposure in the Marvel Comics and cartoon. Ralph W. Pulaski, designation Tank Commander, codename Steeler. In every toy line, there is the toy, the centerpiece of a line that everybody wants. For the first wave of G.I. Joe toys, the motorized battle tank, or MOBAT for short, filled that role. As the name suggests, the MOBAT was a battery-operated tank that could move on its own and roll over uneven surfaces with ease. And the Joe Steeler, with his unique oversized visor, was the driver of that motorized behemoth. Unfortunately, I never got myself a MOBAT, so I never owned a vintage Steeler. I did manage to get myself a modern version of the guy, still without the MOBAT, years later off eBay. It's worth mentioning that in the cartoon, he was written off the series in a unique way. In the 2-part episode Worlds Without End, Steeler and a group of Joes are transported to an alternate dimension where Cobra has defeated G.I. Joe, with most of their members either MIA or dead, including that world's Steeler. Then, in an odd twist, the Cobra Baroness is revealed to be a double agent for the Joe Resistance, and the lover of that world's Steeler. In the end, Steeler decides to stay in the alternate world to continue the fight against Cobra with the Baroness. Finally, in the more mature IDW Comic Joe universe, Steeler was revealed to be a deep-cover Cobra agent who was eventually killed by another agent to protect Cobra interests. Lonzo R. Wilkinson, designation Ranger, codename Stalker. At first glance, Stalker would look like yet another token member, with him being the only African American on the team, placed there for diversity's sake. But it really didn't matter to me that he was African American. All I cared about was that Stalker was definitely one of the cooler looking figures, being the only one donning a camouflage uniform and having a unique head sculpt sporting a beret. His unique appearance gives off the impression that he was meant to be one of the more heavily featured characters in the line. And he was. He's often depicted as Hawk's and later Duke's right-hand man, and is one of the few breakout characters from the original 13. Robert W. Graves, designation Infantry Trooper, codename Grunt. When I first looked at the card back, I thought that this guy was the leader. His card art depicted him running directly at you. I don't know, as a kid that struck me as very leader-like. Plus, in the first toy catalog, his card art is featured on the first page where the Legend of G.I. Joe is written. I also didn't really know what the word grunt meant in a military sense. I just thought that he liked to grunt a lot because, he ran so much. Cut me some slack, I was 6. As it turned out, I was way off base as grunt actually meant a low-ranking or unskilled soldier. While I don't think that Grunt was the worst Joe on the team, he definitely was the plainest looking and most easily forgettable. His most memorable stories that I remember were that of him leaving the team. In the comics, he was honorably discharged so he could continue his studies. He eventually came back though. And in the cartoons, he also decided to stay with Steeler and Clutch in that alternate dimension to rebuild the Joe team. Such a convenient way to write off 3 original members of the team. Alvin R. Kibbe, designation Communications Officer, codename Breaker. For some reason, as a kid, I had a bias against action figures with beards. I didn't like them. I liked my heroes to be clean-shaved. Sue me. This was probably one of the reasons I didn't like Breaker very much as a kid. What was odd though was that his card art did show him as clean-shaven, which I could never understand. I felt that based on the card art, I had the wrong figure in my hands. Anyway, the main reason I didn't like him though was that he didn't come with any weapons. His main accessory was his headset, which was unique and admittedly cool. Unfortunately, he was one of the figures my dad took the initiative to open up and place inside my G.I. Joe carry case, and that little headset accessory somehow got lost in the transfer from packaging to case, so all I got was some bearded dude with a helmet and a backpack. Hasbro did manage to make a more exciting modern update by not only giving him 1, but 2 pistols that he could neatly holster. They also went the extra mile by giving him a semi-shave as the new Breaker now just sported a lighter afternoon shadow. They also amusingly gave him a little bubblegum bubble accessory in homage to his comic book character that was known for constantly chewing gum and blowing bubbles. And speaking of the comics, Breaker has the unfortunate fate of being the first of the original 13 Joes in the Marvel run to get killed. During a botched mission, Cobra captures Breaker and his fellow Joes. Eventually, they manage to escape on a hijacked Cobra tank, but they don't make it far as the tank is ultimately blown up. While a few Joes survive the blast, Breaker isn't one of them. James J. Barney, designation Laser Artillery Soldier, codename Grand Slam. Of all the original Joes, Grand Slam was probably the most obscure. To be honest, there really wasn't much to him. For starters, he and Flash were basically the same figure. They only differentiated in head sculpt, and instead of brown, he sported black gloves and boots. But everything else was the same, including the red padding that everyone associated with Flash. He was not sold single-packed, but instead came with the HAL, short for Heavy Artillery Laser, that could be towed around by the Vamp. Anyway, Hasbro pretty quickly must have realized their mistake in making him too similar to Flash, and so the following year, they re-released him with another playset, the Jet Unit Mobile Propulsion, or JUMP, Launchpad. This time around, they gave him a more unique paint scheme, now sporting silver padding. And from that point on, I always identified him as the jetpack guy on the team. They managed to take a step back in his first modern version though. While retaining the silver padding, they basically gave him the exact same head sculpt as the new Flash. Eventually though, they got it right in the later release, giving him his own unique head sculpt, but curiously, a more metallic blue-silver color for his padding. Anyway, flashy padding aside, like I said, there really wasn't much to the character himself. He was barely in the cartoon, if he was there at all, and his only memorable comic appearance that I can remember was when he captured Major Blood by kicking through a bus windshield window to get to him in the original Marvel run. He fared even worse in the IDW comics, where he was basically introduced and then killed off by a sniper all in the same page. Next up, Classified. Designation Commando. Codename Snake Eyes. Well, there really isn't much to say about this guy. He didn't talk and was dressed in black, so let's move on. I kid. I think it's a safe bet to assume that anyone who's at least familiar with G.I. Joe knows who Snake Eyes is. Did you know that G.I. Joe's most popular character was actually created by Hasbro as yet another attempt to save money? In order to further cut on production costs, they designed a figure clad all in black and wearing a nondescript mask, so they could save on paint by molding him in black plastic and do away with the need to paint any fine details like a face. How ironic that a cost-cutting measure like this eventually turned out to be the major cash cow for the toy line. Anyway, while most people are more familiar with the Ninja Snake Eyes, I prefer this original version where he is basically a commando. Now, I'm not sure if Larry Hama, the godfather of G.I. Joe and the one who wrote pretty much all of the character bios on the vintage file cards, planned for Snake Eyes to be a ninja from the start. But based on his original text, he was always meant to be special, as he is described as mysterious. Anyway, I'm pretty sure I'm eventually going to talk more about this guy in his own video sometime in the future, so I'll stop here for now. Craig S. McConnell, designation Machine Gunner, codename Rock and Roll. Just like Breaker, Rock and Roll's beard did him in for me. It's obvious from his file card that he was meant to be the cool guy in the team. He was a former surfer from Malibu, California, and a bassist from a local rock band. Unfortunately, I thought he looked more like an old man in his card art. In any case, that didn't stop me from getting him when I saw him in a grocery store during a trip in the US. Since I was traveling, I didn't really have much else with me, so Rock and Roll eventually won me over as he served as my travel buddy for about a month. He served as the original machine gunner of the team, and he has managed to stay fairly relevant up to today, despite the introduction of a more popular machine gunner a few years later. And finally, we have Rafael J. Melendez, designation Bazooka Soldier, codename Zap. I always found this guy's name rather odd as it reminded me more of the 80s comedy Zapped. I also figured that the name was more apt for the team's electrician than a bazooka soldier. Oh well, I guess it would have been better than calling him Kablam. Anyway, Zap was yet another action figure that drove me nuts, since his card art clearly showed that he sported a mustache while his action figure didn't. It bugged the hell out of me. What can I say? Even at a young age, consistency mattered to me. Mustache aside though, it's worth noting that Zap was also Hispanic. In today's world, where diversity, or lack of it, is constantly scrutinized in pop culture characters, adding a Hispanic character to the team to appease the masses would have been expected, but back in the 80s, it wasn't. So I think it was fairly progressive on Hasbro's part to take the initiative in creating a fairly diverse initial team of Joes, without making a big issue out of it. Zap was just a soldier like all his other teammates who just happened to be Hispanic. Zap was the final member of the team that got a modern update, and thankfully, to put my mind at ease, they gave him a mustache. So there you go, a rundown of the first members of the G.I. Joe team collectively known as the Original 13. As a team, they were only given their due recognition in the original Marvel run. But by issue 11, newer characters started getting introduced in the series on a regular basis to keep up with the ever-expanding toy line. It wasn't long before members of the original 13 that weren't named Stalker, Scarlett, or Snake Eyes were pretty much forgotten and replaced by newer and more visually exciting characters. But for a collector like myself, who started collecting from the very beginning of the toy line, I will always have a special appreciation for the original 13, the first real American heroes. So what about you guys? Are there any other fans of the original 13? Who was your favorite of the group? Let me know in the comments below and tell me your story. Thanks for watching Stories from the Toy Shelf. If you enjoyed this story, please help me out by giving it a like, comment, and subscribe to the channel to get notifications whenever I upload a new story. Until the next one,